Wouldn't you like to live in a world where the government didn't interfere in your private life, where you paid minimal taxes and were free to do whatever you wanted to do as long as it didn't infringe on others' freedoms? Well then, you might be a libertarian. Or you might not be a libertarian, but we're going to talk about it.
Actually, that pretty much hits the nail on the head. If you think the government should leave people alone who aren't hurting anybody or not interfere in people's personal lives, then yeah, you're a libertarian. Well, I suppose a slight correction is in order. You see, we don't think anybody should be able to interfere in people's personal lives. And well, government is simply made up of people. So if you apply that logic consistently, well, the conclusion you arrive at is that government shouldn't be able to interfere in people's personal lives either.
But what do libertarians believe in?
Hurting people is bad. That pretty much sums it up.
Well, the core value of libertarianism is
if he says anything other than the non-aggression principle, it's going to be a straw man.
small government, which is a vague concept meaning pretty much whatever any individual libertarian wants it to mean.
Mr. Strawman, give me a break!
Most people's understanding of libertarian ideology doesn't go much far past small government, and naturally this makes it easy to misrepresent libertarianism as arbitrary. What no one ever seems to want to discuss is why is it that libertarians favor small government? Most people like to chalk it off as we just have some kind of weird hate boner for government, and never bother really looking into what our core principles are. You see, we believe in something called the non-aggression principle. Without going into too much detail, the gist of it is that because it can be objectively proven that you own yourself, you have certain rights which follow from this fact. Now, as I've mentioned in the beginning of this video, our ideology is more or less impartial as to whom specifically would be violating these rights. The reason our radar tends to be on government in particular is because of the power and role in society that it has. There's more of a chance, there's a greater risk that government will infringe upon these rights more so than any other entity. So the next time you hear someone say libertarians are for small government, while that may be true, do bear in mind that there is more to it than that. This is actually a more apt criticism of authoritarianism. Authoritarians draw the line for what authority government should have on the basis of what's convenient for them personally. They don't believe in fundamental rights the same way we do, which is why you have one side saying we have the right to, smoke drugs, but you shouldn't be able to keep guns, and the other side saying you should be able to keep guns but no drugs, even though you can draw the same conclusion. The right to both is supported by the same line of reasoning.
So anything from keeping the government out of your bedroom to the privatization of almost every function of government, from education to the police force, can fall under the libertarian agenda.
So recall a moment ago that Assad here was telling us about how libertarianism was completely arbitrary. Notice, however, that all the examples he gives of libertarian agendas all seem to have similar attributes in common. And since all these examples seem to center around the same goal or underlying theme, it would seem as if there is, after all, some sort of underlying consistent principle to libertarianism. So then, which is it, Mr. Piker? Is libertarianism arbitrary, or is it based on consistent principles? You did, after all, choose these examples. So it would be reasonable to assume that there's some sort of basis that you reasoned upon selecting these examples to portray the libertarian platform.
So it really shouldn't be a surprise that fiscally conservative Republicans are more likely to vote libertarian than Democrats.
Would it surprise you to know that we actually have quite a bit of support from Democrats too? It's true. If you look at the polls for a lot of prominent libertarian candidates, the data shows that support for libertarianism is more or less evenly distributed between the two parties. In fact, Gary Johnson is actually more supported by Democrats, believe it or not, who knew? Now, if you're familiar with the Young Turks, you'll know that they tend to lean left. As a matter of fact, even if you're not familiar with them, their portrayal of libertarianism as Republican sympathetic ought to have made that crystal clear. So naturally, Assad here does agree with us on our social views. He does agree that we should get rid of victimless crimes and roll back police power. Where he seems to disagree with us on is our economic views. Our views regarding property rights and the free market.
However, on social issues, some of the libertarian policy positions are actually more progressive than an Occupy Wall Street drum circle.
So he's referring to libertarianism as progressive, which could be a compliment or insult depending on the context. If he means progressive as in progress, as in this is an improvement, then yeah, that's a compliment. If, however, he's trying to associate libertarianism with other political ideologies that have been historically given the label progressive, then yeah, that's actually a pretty big insult.
A libertarian stance on social issues include making prostitution legal and legalizing all drugs, even the good ones. Libertarians also believe that no military action should be taken against foreign nations unless the US is attacked first. All of which sounds great to me. But what doesn't sound as great are libertarian ideals on the economic front.
Now, before we continue, we should probably first lay out and make it completely clear what exactly the libertarian views on economic issues are, since this appears to be where his criticism is focused. Well, as we've already established, our fundamental belief is that you own yourself, right? This is why we can say that stuff like assault and murder and rape is wrong, because these actions are a direct attack on the person on themselves, which interferes with their right to themselves. Mr. Piker here seems to be on the same page with us as far as that goes, since he agrees with our social views, that people shouldn't be harmed if they're not harming anyone. However, if you believe that people own themselves, well then one of the implications of that is that they own their time and labor. Think about this for a moment. Suppose you didn't own your time and labor, someone else owned it, someone else was able to dictate how you use your time or take advantage of labor that you perform. If you were in that situation, you're essentially a slave, wouldn't you be? Would it make much sense to say that I don't own my time and labor but still own myself? Does it make any sort of logical sense to say that I'm a free slave? So, if you own yourself, and that means you own your time and labor, well, the logical conclusion of that is property rights. If it's wrong to take advantage of other people's time and labor directly, why would it be any better doing it after the fact? Or to put it another way, suppose that someone were to capture me, enslave me, and force me to do $200 worth of work for them. And in a different scenario, suppose that someone approached me on the street, mugged me for $200 that I earned from doing work. Both scenarios raise the same fundamental moral issue. You're taking advantage of time and labor that I performed, that I'm entitled to. You're just doing it after the fact. So to summarize it all, we believe that you own yourself, therefore you own your time and labor, therefore you own the results of your time and labor, therefore you're entitled to your property. Or another more intuitive way of putting it, that I feel helps to emphasize what's at issue here, our economic views logically follow from our social views. And this raises some problems for Hassan because he wants to deny the latter but affirm the former. And the only way you can do that, the only way he'd be able to pull this off, what he's trying to do, is to attack the line of reasoning in between. Say, yes, I agree with P, but it doesn't follow to Q, and your line of reasoning is flawed, and explain why that is. And let's see if he does that.
Libertarianism comes down to the belief that the principles that drive a free market economy can be applied to how humans govern themselves.
Because that's pretty much all the free market is. By definition, the free market is the system by which people govern themselves. People formulate through one means or another what the optimal use of their resources would be, and usually voluntarily associate with others to best meet the needs of all individuals involved.
It's this idea that an invisible hand that guides the free market will also drive human interaction with social order.
Let's take a moment real quick to discuss this invisible hand concept, because it generally just seems to create a lot of confusion among people who criticize the free market. The invisible hand is actually a metaphor. It's not something that actually exists. The invisible hand is a metaphor intended to get across the idea that individuals acting in their own self-interest, reasoning on their own what the best decisions would be to use the resources that they have, tends to optimize resource distribution on society as a whole, more so than any centralized or collectivized system would.
This foundation is one that I disagree with, because when unchecked, man motivated by self-gain will not ultimately do the right thing.
Well, who said people go unchecked in the free market? The free market works as well as it does precisely because people are carefully checked. The free market isn't free in the sense that you can do whatever the hell you want without consequences. What makes the free market free is the decisions you get to make with whom you associate with, on what basis, how to use your property, things like that. That's what makes it free. And this freedom of choice enables individuals to associate in ways that will maximize their benefit. So in a system where you're free to choose, and generally you want to make choices that will maximize whatever end you're trying to accomplish, you're going to be incentivized to heavily scrutinize anyone you're doing business with. So yeah, the free market is anything but unchecked.
This is why there are criminals, those who commit crimes, even when there is a system that actively tries to prevent it.
Oh joy, what irony. Hassan is aware of the fundamental issue with everything he's about to advocate for.
And then the whole purpose of civilization should be to ensure that everyone is fed, clothed, housed, and not to create conditions so that the few can secure a substantially greater portion of resources while others are virtually left with nothing.
So you get nothing! You lose! Good day, sir!
Civilization is simply just people living and cooperating together to mutually improve the quality of life for everyone. Since it's a rather vague concept, you can't really attach an overall goal or purpose to it. Unless of course it's in video game form. Then the purpose is to kick as much barbarian ass as possible, and finish your spaceship before Caesar finishes his. Now you could make the argument that no one ought to be left, to starve to death in a modern society. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, but where does charity and humanitarian aid tend to prosper? The same kind of environment where other types of businesses tend to prosper, in the free market.
So in a libertarian society, who protects the unprotected? Who defends the rights of the defenseless?
Anyone else who's able and willing. Authoritarians are stuck in this strange mindset where if government's not doing this, then that means nobody's doing it. Oh, if Safeway shuts down, our whole town will be left without groceries and we'll all starve to death. Or we'll just go over to Food Lion, which is in the next town over.
Even libertarians acknowledge that a free market will drive a larger wealth disparity.
Actually, quite the contrary. A system where people are free to decide how to pursue a living uninhibited would create more opportunities and therefore less wealth disparity.
Which some believe will be offset by the trickling down of wealth and technology.
Yeah, that's another nifty thing about capitalism. Not only are there more opportunities for the lower class to move up, but the lower classes also enjoy a higher standard of living due to free market innovation making things cheaper. There was a time when owning things like cars, refrigerators, color television sets were the equivalent of owning a private jet or yacht nowadays.
But wealth inequality paired with deregulation creates an opportunity for haves to rule over the have-nots.
And once again, the bogus class warfare narrative rears its ugly head. This idea that the rich somehow gain their wealth at the expense of the poor is a complete false dichotomy. More often than not, these big, bad, greedy rich people gained their wealth by providing better quality of life, goods and services to society, and in that process enable others to do so as well. As I've just mentioned a moment ago, free market innovation not only improved quality of life, but also opportunities for people to succeed. So when you focus on wealth inequality specifically, you're really missing what's important. Would you rather have an equal slice of a small pie or an unequal slice of a large pie?
This is one of the many reasons for regulation.
Regulators. We regulate any stealing of his property. We're damn good, too.
To ensure that the rich few do not impose their will unjustly or destructively on the poor multitudes.
History shows that regulations have mostly had the opposite effect. By making it more difficult to conduct business, they're essentially creating artificial hurdles for people who want to enter the market. The result is that less people have an opportunity to earn a living, and therefore this drives the wedge between the rich and poor further.
Another libertarian belief is the idea that the government should not be allowed to impose its will on the citizenry. However, in a truly free market that promotes freedom of contract and deregulation, employers have a right to force...
Well, actually, no. Freedom of contract means they specifically don't get to do that. You see, one of the key underlying concepts within freedom of contract is what's called meeting of the minds, which is basically a fancy legal way of saying everyone involved in the contract or agreement has to be doing so of their own free will. And well, if someone is using, threats of violence or coercion to get me to agree with the contract, then obviously it's not of my own free will. So anytime you have someone using violence or threats of coercion to get someone to agree to a contract, that's called duress, and the contract is void. Now, of course, usually when this point is brought up, it's typically within the context of forced by circumstance, as in the employer isn't directly coercing me to work for him, but there aren't jobs available elsewhere at the moment, and I have to work in order to survive. So I'm de facto being forced by that employer to work for them. In which case, refer to my earlier points about there being more opportunities in a free market.
Rules that would never be permitted in our current democratic systems.
He mentions that these agreements wouldn't be allowed in our current democratic systems, which brings up another important point regarding freedom of contract. You see, not only do you have freedom from contract, that is to say nobody can force you into an agreement with them against your will, you also have freedom to contract. That is, nobody can interfere with you entering into agreements with other people. Or to put it another way, so long as everyone involved in a contract or agreement is doing so of their own free will, and they're only making agreements that they can legitimately carry out, for example, they're not agreeing to sell someone else's property or something like that, then no third party has the right to forcibly intervene on that agreement. Be that third party one person, an organization, or 51% of the population. The idea that this is legitimate for certain people, say a government or a democratic body or something along those lines, results in stuff like minimum wage or bans on stuff like selling drugs or prostitution, stuff which limits the freedom of individuals to pursue a living, which ultimately contributes to the very problems Mr. Piker shows so much concern for in this video.
Libertarianism is a rich man's ideal.
Well, that's funny because it seems quite often that rich people are actually the ones mostly advocating for stuff libertarians are against. For example, a lot of rich corporations actually lobby for regulations, and it seems like every time I turn my head there's another celebrity clamoring on about either gun control or expanding the welfare state. If you really look at the demographics of who identifies as libertarian, what you find is rather interesting. Libertarian ideology seems to be rather popular with the working class, the poor, and small business owners, the very people whom authoritarians claim to have their interests at heart.
It ostensibly gives ultimate freedoms and choice to everyone at the cost of helping the helpless.
Well, whoever said those goals are mutually exclusive? As I've mentioned previously, humanitarian aid, just like any other business, thrives best in a free market environment. Not only is there more help for the helpless, but there's less helpless, due to the increased opportunities that the free market enables.
It completely ignores the reality of economic forces.
Oh, we're the ones ignoring economic forces, huh? Okay then, could you please explain to me how businesses are supposed to get these extra resources needed to comply with your regulations? These regulations are supposed to look out for the little man, the working class. You don't think the working class is going to, get their jobs cut or have the price of the commodities that they need increase?
Which compel the poor to take jobs they don't want to and live where they don't want to just because they have to. You can't completely deny that. You can't not see that reality.
Oh, we see the reality all right, and I got news for you, Mr. Piker. There will always be people having to either live or work in places they may not necessarily want to. You see, there's a simple fact of reality that will always hold true in whatever political or economic system you're in. There will always be more demand for goods or resources than there will be resources available to satisfy those demands. Or to put it another way, you can't consume more resources than exist. This is a fact of reality. No politician, no law, nothing can make that different. Nothing will change that. So the question isn't under what system are all my needs, satisfied, because such a system couldn't exist. The better question would be, given all of the possibilities, which system is most likely to enable me to have what I want? At least most, if not all. And history shows time and time again that that system is free market capitalism. Sure, there may not be enough beachfront condos to go around, but if you had your heart set on one, your chances would probably be better in the United States or Western Europe versus Venezuela or North Korea.
And while individual freedoms extending to property rights are in the forefront of the core principles of libertarianism,
actually the fact that you own yourself and that slavery is wrong is the forefront of libertarianism. Our views regarding property rights just happen to be a byproduct of that.
deregulation in a free market economy that will lead to an even bigger wealth gap sounds like the prologue to the movie Elysium, starring Matt Damon, or Snowpiercer.
You know what's funny? At no point in this video does he ever cite any articles, charts, any data sources. He does, however, manage to cite pieces of fiction. And well, if that's the standard of evidence you're going to use, well, I could just as easily say, if you want to know what would happen if we had things your way, watch The Matrix or 1984.
Or any other dystopian future pick where classism runs rampant and the massive lower income classes rise against their small but incredibly wealthy oppressors. If you really want to understand what would happen in a libertarian society, watch that movie, watch Elysium.
Or you could look up actual historic and economic data, not just pieces of fiction.
That's a libertarian utopia, where the wealth disparity is abysmal and the eroding middle class is fully shifted well below the poverty line.
Admittedly, I've never seen Elysium, but if such a state of affairs were to happen in real life, I have a feeling government would most likely be involved.
Yes, We will likely continue to make technological advancements that allow for like robotic arms like the ones that Matt Damon uses in that movie, but increasingly in service to a narrower and narrower segment of the population.
So apparently, according to the young Turks' understanding of economics, businesses seek out a narrow as possible customer base.
Now, you may see the poor or the underclass as weak.
We don't. We see them as artificially restrained by big government.
You may see them as the losers in this giant meritocratic experiment that is the libertarian ideal. But weak as they are,
there it is, made obvious, plain as day. Authoritarians see the poor as weak. You see, if you're poor, authoritarians want you to think that they're on your side, that they have your back, that they argue for stuff like welfare and social safety nets to, your benefit. The truth is, they actually see you as political fodder, as vote cattle. You see, if you're hooked on those social safety nets, if you rely on welfare, they're basically guaranteed a vote from you, especially if the other candidate is advocating rolling back social safety nets. So there's an incentive by these politicians on the left to try and have you snagged, to try and have you caught in these social safety nets so that way you can't escape. It is counter to their interests that you be a fully independent person.
there are going to be a hell of a lot more of them than there are of you.
And therefore a market incentive to satisfy their interests.
So in the hopes of avoiding the fate of the monarchy during the French Revolution, maybe it's best to retain welfare and at least a modest social safety net, if for no other reason than to keep them from grabbing their pitchforks and turning on you. Think of it as like a riot tax.
So to argue that we need big government in order to prevent the oppression of the poor, he uses an example of the poor being oppressed by big government? Huh?
In the end, libertarianism is similar to communism. I know that sounds a little crazy, but hear me out. On its face, they're both noble but impossibly ambitious theories.
A lot of you are probably expecting me to be mad about him comparing libertarianism to communism, but the truth is I'm actually not. As a matter of fact, the two ideologies are 100% compatible. You see, in a libertarian society, where you can do whatever you please as long as you're not hurting anyone, there'd be absolutely nothing stopping you from getting yourself a piece of land, starting your own commune on it, inviting people to participate. The same would go for any other system of government. For example, let's say we all lived in a libertarian society. Well then, Mr. Piker here would be able to buy some land, start whatever system of government he thinks is the best on his own property. The only caveat being he wouldn't be able to force people to participate who don't want to. Any political system or setup in the world that you think would be best, and the only price you have to pay is needing people's consent in order to participate. Seems like a good deal to me.
One has individual freedom as its core principle and the other equality. However, in practice, both concepts lead to outcomes that aren't as pure. Unlike communism, we've yet to see libertarianism crumble after application.
Then how can you make an accurate prediction as to whether or not it'll work? If anything, that's an argument for rather than against trying libertarianism.
But given the current state of the Republican Party, we may see its influence soon enough.
I could probably make a drinking game out of this whole libertarians or Republican thing. Actually, never mind, my liver would be dead by video 7.
I'm just here to warn you ahead of time. I'm Hassan Piker, and this is The Breakdown.
I'm Philosophossum, and you have been broken down. Thanks for watching. This has been Philosophossum making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.